Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. The homeless man's scream echoed through Detroit's Cass corridor like a bullet ricocheting off concrete walls. Marcus Reeves clutched his bleeding hand to his chest, watching dark blood seep through his fingers and drip onto the frost-covered ground. 20 years ago, he'd been Marcus Reeves, shift supervisor at the Chrysler plant, father of two, husband to a beautiful wife named Eleanor. Now, at 58, he was just another shadow haunting the broken streets of Detroit's forgotten district. The bite shouldn't have hurt this much. Marcus leaned against the crumbling brick wall of the abandoned Alhambra apartments, his makeshift home for the past 3 winters. The November wind howled through the urban canyons, carrying the scent of burning trash and despair. Above him, clouds scudded across a steel-gray sky, threatening snow. The sun was setting early, as it always did this time of year, painting the graffiti-covered buildings in shades of bruised purple and angry red. The rat that had bitten him was unlike anything he'd seen in his years on the streets. Detroit had rats, every homeless person knew that. But this one had been different. Larger, more aggressive, with eyes that gleamed an unnatural shade of crimson in the failing light. When it launched itself at his hand, its bite felt calculated, purposeful. Now, as darkness crept across the corridor like spilled ink, Marcus felt the first waves of fever washing over him. The wound throbbed with an intensity that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, and strange patterns of light danced at the edges of his vision. He needed help. 3 blocks away, Sarah Chen was just finishing her shift at the free clinic. At 32, she'd spent the last 5 years serving the corridor's vulnerable population, earning the trust of people society had forgotten. Her father, a successful surgeon in Ann Arbor, called it a waste of her talent. Sarah called it her calling. She just finished updating Mrs. Rodriguez's medical records when Tommy, one of their regular patients, burst through the clinic's doors. Blood streamed from a gash in his forearm. "They're crazy," he gasped, collapsing into a chair. "Just started attacking people, like animals." Sarah grabbed her medical kit. "Who's attacking people, Tommy?" "Marcus and others. Something's wrong with them. Their eyes." Tommy shuddered. "Started with Marcus. He bit someone, and then they both just changed." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew Marcus, had treated him for years. He was one of the gentlest souls she'd ever met, despite his rough appearance. The idea of him attacking anyone seemed absurd. Before she could question Tommy further, screams erupted from the street outside. Sarah rushed to the window. In the gathering darkness, she could make out several figures moving with jerky, unnatural motions. A woman ran past the clinic, pursued by what looked like Mr. Henderson from the convenience store. But something was wrong with Henderson's gait. He moved like a puppet with half its strings cut. "Lock the doors," Sarah ordered the clinic's security guard, James Wilson. "Now!" But James was already moving, his face grim. 20 years as a Detroit cop before retiring to clinic security had taught him to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. The clinic's ancient fluorescent lights flickered as Sarah treated Tommy's wound. The cut was deep, but clean. Not a bite. Still, his story about Marcus troubled her. She'd just seen Marcus yesterday, giving him his regular blood pressure medication. He'd been fine then, telling her about his granddaughter's latest letter. A crash from the front of the clinic made them both jump. Through the reception area's windows, Sarah could see shapes moving in the darkness. Multiple shapes, pressing against the glass with increasing force. "We need to move," James announced, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Back door, through the lab, now." They had just reached the corridor leading to the lab when the front windows imploded. The sounds that followed would haunt Sarah's nightmares for years to come. The wet slap of bodies climbing through broken glass, inhuman growls, and beneath it all, a high-pitched keening that made her skin crawl. James pushed them toward the lab. "Go! I'll hold them." The security guard never finished his sentence. A figure launched itself from the shadows. Marcus Reeves, but not the Marcus she knew. His skin was corpse pale, dark veins standing out like roads on a map. His eyes... Sarah's medical mind registered the symptoms even as she recoiled. Extreme mydriasis, hemorrhaging in the sclera, signs of severe infection. But it was the intelligence behind those eyes that terrified her. Feral, hungry, yet somehow calculating. James managed to get off 2 shots before Marcus reached him. The bullet struck center mass, but Marcus didn't even slow down. His teeth sank into James's throat in a spray of arterial blood. "Run!" James screamed, his last act of service to protect those in his care. Sarah grabbed Tommy's arm and ran. The clinic's lab was Dr. Marcus Wong's sanctuary. Even now, working late as usual, he was focused on his microscope, unaware of the chaos unfolding above. The Harvard-educated virologist had chosen to work in the corridor despite countless offers from prestigious research hospitals. Like Sarah, he believed in serving those most in need. The specimen under his microscope was from a routine blood test, but something about it bothered him. The patient had complained of fever and aggressive impulses shortly after being bitten by a rat. Normally, Wong would have prescribed antibiotics and a tetanus shot, but these blood cells, they were behaving strangely. As he adjusted the magnification, the lab's lights flickered. Wong looked up, annoyed. That's when he heard the screams. Footsteps thundered down the stairs to the lab. Wong reached for the phone on his desk, but the line was dead. The door burst open, revealing Sarah Chen and Tommy, both out of breath and spattered with blood. "Dr. Wong," Sarah gasped. "We need to seal the lab. Now." Wong didn't argue. Years of working with dangerous pathogens had taught him to act first and ask questions later when it came to potential contamination. He quickly entered the code that would seal the lab's security doors, a system installed due to their work with controlled substances. The heavy doors slid shut just as the first infected reached them. Through the reinforced windows, Wong watched in horror as more gathered. Their movements were wrong, their faces twisted in feral snarls. Among them, he recognized several clinic patients. "What happened up there?" he demanded. Sarah quickly explained while helping Tommy into a chair. Wong's face grew increasingly grave as she described Marcus's transformation and James's last stand. "Show me the bite marks on the infected," he said. "What? The ones who've turned, they were all bitten, yes?" Sarah thought back. Yes, Marcus bit James, and Tommy said Marcus was bitten by a rat, Wong finished. He turned to his microscope. "Look at this." Sarah peered through the lens at the blood sample. Even with her medical training, it took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The blood cells were mutating, their structure changing in real time. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That sample is from yesterday. Another rat bite victim. I've never seen a pathogen behave like this. The rate of mutation, the way it affects cellular structure." Wong's voice trailed off as he studied the infected pressing against the lab windows. "This isn't natural." A new sound cut through the chaos, breaking glass from the floor above, followed by inhuman shrieks. The infected were finding other ways into the building. "We need to document this," Wong said, already moving to gather samples and notes. "If this is what I think it is, Sarah, humanity needs to know what we're dealing with." Outside the lab, Detroit was transforming. The infection spread through the corridor like wildfire, following the paths of human connection. A bite victim would turn within an hour, attacking friends and family without recognition. Those who survived the initial attacks turned just as quickly, creating a cascade of violence that overwhelmed local emergency services. Detective James Rodriguez was working late at his desk in the central precinct when the first calls came in. 20 years on the force hadn't prepared him for what he was hearing. Multiple reports of violent attacks, suspects seemingly immune to pain or verbal commands, victims displaying extreme behavioral changes within minutes of being bitten. Rodriguez, Lieutenant Sarah Harper's voice cut through the chaos of the dispatch center. We need you in the corridor. Something's gone sideways at the free clinic. James grabbed his coat, checking his service weapon and spare magazines. His partner, Diana Wells, fell into step beside him as they headed for the parking garage. What are we looking at? Diana asked. Mass casualty event, possible riot situation, James replied, but something in his gut told him this was different. He'd grown up in the corridor, still lived there in the Strathmore apartments. He knew its rhythms, its patterns of violence. This felt wrong. As they pulled out of the garage, James's radio crackled with an update. All units be advised, CDC representatives are en route. Possible biological hazard. Do not approach infected individuals without proper protection. Diana looked at him. Biological hazard? What the hell is going on? The scene that greeted them at the edge of the corridor answered her question in the worst possible way. The streets were chaos incarnate. People ran in every direction, pursued by figures that moved with jerky, aggressive determination. As James watched, one of the pursuers caught a fleeing woman. The attack that followed was brutal, animalistic. Jesus Christ, Diana breathed, drawing her weapon. A figure slammed into their cruiser's hood, a teenage boy, but his face was wrong. Dark veins pulsed beneath pale skin, and his eyes. James felt his world tilt as he recognized the kid who delivered his newspapers. Mike? He called out, but there was no recognition in those feral eyes. The boy launched himself at the windshield with inhuman strength, spider-webbing the glass. Diana threw the car into reverse as more infected emerged from the shadows, attracted by the noise. Central, be advised, James radioed, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. We need full tactical response. Multiple hostile individuals showing signs of infection. Request immediate evacuation of civilians from the corridor. But as they retreated to establish a perimeter, James knew it was already too late. The corridor's narrow streets and dense population had become a perfect breeding ground for whatever this was. And somewhere in that maze of darkness and violence was his apartment building, where his elderly neighbors trusted their security to locked doors and his protection. He had to go back. In the sealed laboratory beneath the free clinic, Dr. Wong worked frantically to document his findings. The virus defied everything he knew about pathogen behavior. Under his microscope, infected blood cells didn't just mutate, they seemed to communicate with each other, coordinating their changes in ways that should have been impossible. Sarah, look at this, he called out, adjusting the microscope's focus. The virus isn't just affecting individual cells. It's creating a network. Sarah left her makeshift barricade by the door to peer through the lens. Tommy had fallen asleep in the corner, his wound properly bandaged but his fever rising. They both knew what that meant. The virus could spread through more than just bites. It's like they're forming a hive mind, Sarah whispered, watching the cells pulse in synchronized patterns. A crash from above made them both jump. The infected were systematically searching the building, their movements becoming more coordinated with each passing hour. Wong quickly transferred his findings to an encrypted hard drive, along with his suspicions about the virus's origins. This isn't random mutation, he explained, fingers flying over his keyboard. The virus's structure shows signs of engineering. Someone designed this, Sarah. They weaponized it. But why? Sarah asked, helping him gather crucial samples. Why start it in the corridor? Think about it. Dense population, limited resources, high poverty rate, perfect testing ground. And rats. Wong's voice trailed off as scratching sounds emerged from the ventilation system. They're the perfect vector. Every city has a rat problem, especially in poor areas. The scratching grew louder. Outside, Detective James Rodriguez and his partner Diana Wells had reached the Strathmore apartments. The street was a war zone. Burning cars provided irregular islands of light in the gathering darkness. The infected moved through the shadows in packs now, herding survivors into blind alleys. James, we need to call for backup, Diana insisted, checking her ammunition. 3 magazines left, plus what was in her weapon. No time, James replied. He just spotted Mrs. Peterson through her 3rd-floor window, frantically waving for help. Building's still secure, but they're gathering. We go now or we don't go at all. They made it to the front door just as the first pack of infected charged. Diana dropped 2 with headshots, but the others didn't even slow. James unlocked the security door with shaking hands, pulling Diana inside as snapping teeth closed inches from her shoulder. The lobby was dark, emergency lights casting everything in a bloody red glow. James led the way up the stairs, his weapon ready. They found Mrs. Peterson on the 3rd floor, barricaded in her apartment with her husband Robert and 3 other residents. Thank God, Mrs. Peterson sobbed. Robert's sick. He was bitten, trying to help the Martinez boy from 4B. James looked at Robert Peterson, retired high school principal, deacon at First Baptist, married 40 years. Sweat beaded on the older man's forehead, and dark veins were beginning to show under his skin. How long ago? Diana asked softly. 20 minutes, Robert answered, his voice steady despite the tremors racking his body. I can feel it, changing me. You need to get them out of here now. Robert, no, Mrs. Peterson pleaded. We can get help. Martha, Robert's voice cracked. My love, you know there's no help coming, not in time. He turned to James. You have your cuffs, detective? James nodded, understanding. With tears in her eyes, Mrs. Peterson watched as they handcuffed her husband to the radiator. Robert kissed her hand one last time. Go, he whispered. Remember me as I was. They had just reached the stairwell when Robert's screams began. Across the city, the military response was finally mobilizing. Colonel Sarah Brandt stood in the mobile command center, watching drone footage of the spreading infection. 20 years of combat experience, including 2 tours in Iraq, hadn't prepared her for this. Quarantine line is holding at Warren Avenue, her XO reported, but we're getting reports of infected outside the containment zone. How? Brandt demanded. We locked this down. Sewers, another officer interrupted, pulling up infrared imaging. They're using the underground tunnels. And the rats, ma'am, the rats are spreading faster than we can track. Brandt studied the tactical display. The corridor was lost, that was obvious. But they might still be able to contain this if they acted fast enough, decisively enough. The orders she was about to give would end her career if she was wrong. Call in the airstrike, she commanded. We burn it out, now. Back in the clinic's laboratory, Dr. Wong and Sarah had discovered something horrifying. The virus wasn't just coordinating infected individuals, it was evolving them. Blood samples from recently turned victims showed dramatic cellular changes, enhanced muscle density, accelerated healing, and most terrifying of all, signs of neural network development. They're not just getting stronger, Wong explained, securing another sample. They're getting smarter, learning. A ventilation grate crashed to the floor, followed by a wave of rats, dozens of them, their eyes glowing red in the laboratory's emergency lighting. Wong shoved the hard drive into Sarah's hands. Run! Get this to the CDC! It's our only chance. The rats swarmed him before she could react. Sarah grabbed Tommy, pulling him toward the emergency exit as Wong's screams filled the lab. The door sealed behind them automatically, containing the rats but trapping Wong inside. Above ground, James Rodriguez's group had grown. They'd gathered more survivors as they moved through the Strathmore, including a pregnant woman named Maria Santos and her 5-year-old son, Luis. Diana took point as they made their way down to the basement, where the building's old maintenance tunnels could provide an escape route. "Where are we going?" Maria asked, cradling her belly protectively. "Military set up safe zones," James explained, helping Mrs. Peterson down the stairs. "Nearest one's at Wayne State, 2 miles north." 2 miles? Mrs. Peterson's voice shook. "Through that?" A massive explosion rocked the building before James could answer. Through the basement's narrow windows, they saw flashes of light in the sky, jets making their first bombing run on the corridor. "They're burning it," Diana whispered. "My God, they're actually burning it." The building shook again as more explosions walked their way across the district. James pushed open the access door to the maintenance tunnels, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "No choice now," he said. "We go down." The tunnels were a maze of concrete and rusted pipes, decades of Detroit's hidden infrastructure rotting beneath their feet. Water dripped steadily from somewhere ahead, and their flashlight beams caught occasional movements in the shadows. Rats fleeing the chaos above. Luis suddenly screamed. One of the rats had launched itself at the boy's face, moving with unnatural speed. James caught it in mid-leap, crushing it against the wall, but not before its teeth grazed his arm. "James." Diana's voice was heavy with concern. "Keep moving," he ordered, wrapping his arm with a handkerchief. "I'll take rear guard." They all knew what that meant. Sarah Chen emerged from the clinic's emergency exit into a scene from the apocalypse. The military's bombing campaign had set much of the corridor ablaze, creating a hellish landscape of burning buildings and smoke-filled streets. Through the chaos, infected individuals moved with increasing purpose, coordinating their movements like a well-trained hunting pack. She clutched Dr. Wong's hard drive to her chest, supporting Tommy with her other arm. The CDC's forward operating base was somewhere north of here, past Wayne State. But the direct route was blocked by fires and infected. A familiar voice called out from a nearby alley, "Sarah, over here!" Detective Diana Wells waved them over. She stood guard as a group of survivors emerged from a maintenance tunnel. James Rodriguez, an elderly woman, a pregnant woman with a small boy, and others Sarah didn't recognize. "James is infected," Diana said quietly as Sarah approached. "Rat bite. He's giving us as much time as he can." Sarah looked at her own patient. Tommy's fever was spiking, the virus working its way through his system. Soon he'd turn to. "I have something," she said, holding up the hard drive. "Dr. Wong, he found something about the virus. We need to get this to the CDC." High above, military jets screamed through the smoke-filled sky, unleashing another wave of destruction. The infected were learning to avoid the bombs now, taking cover in buildings and tunnels. Each failed attack made them stronger, smarter. The war for Detroit's soul was entering its next phase. But for the survivors trapped in the burning corridor, the only question that mattered was, could they make it through the next hour alive? The group moved through the burning corridor like ghosts, staying low to avoid both the thick smoke and the increasingly organized packs of infected. James Rodriguez took point despite his deteriorating condition, his decades of police experience guiding them through the urban battlefield. Every few minutes, he checked the bite on his arm. The dark veins had spread halfway to his shoulder now. 3 more blocks to the CDC perimeter, he growled, his voice growing rougher with each passing minute. "Follow Warren Avenue. Stay in the shadows." Sarah watched him with professional concern. As a medical practitioner, she'd seen dozens of infections progress now, and she recognized the signs. James had an hour left at most before the change took him. Behind her, Tommy wasn't doing much better. Diana dropped back to walk beside Sarah. "The boy won't make it, will he?" Sarah shook her head. "The virus moves faster in younger people. Their stronger immune systems actually speed up the transformation." She patted the hard drive in her pocket. "But if we can get Dr. Wong's research to the CDC..." An explosion cut her off as another airstrike hit nearby. The military was getting desperate, hitting targets with increasing frequency. But the infected were adapting, learning to anticipate the attack patterns. Some had even started using tools, crude weapons, improvised shields. The virus wasn't just changing their bodies, it was evolving their intelligence. "Movement ahead," James warned, raising his fist in a police hand signal. Lot of them, organized. Through the smoke, they could see a large group of infected blocking Warren Avenue. They moved with military precision, establishing defensive positions and coordinating their movements with hand gestures. At their center stood a figure Sarah recognized, Marcus Reeves, Patient Zero. But he wasn't the confused homeless man anymore. His eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence as he directed his makeshift army. "They're evolving," Sarah whispered, "developing a hierarchy. Marcus was first, he's becoming their leader." "Back," James ordered. "We'll cut through the old theater." He never finished the sentence. A wave of rats poured from a nearby storm drain, hundreds of them, their eyes glowing red in the firelight. The infected turned at the sound, Marcus's head snapping toward their position with terrifying speed. "Run!" Diana screamed, opening fire on the rat swarm. The shots echoed through the street, drawing more infected. The group scattered. Maria Santos and her son Luis followed Diana toward the theater. Mrs. Peterson and two others fled down an alley. Sarah found herself running alongside James, half carrying Tommy as they ducked into the ruins of an old department store. "Get him upstairs," James ordered, covering their retreat. "I'll hold them here." "James, I'm done, Sarah. We both know it, but I can give you time." He checked his remaining ammunition. "Get that research to the CDC. Make this mean something." The last Sarah saw of Detective Rodriguez, he was setting up a defensive position behind an old checkout counter, his movements already showing the jerky precision of the turning. Tommy collapsed halfway up the stairs, his transformation accelerating. "Go," he gasped. I'll help James." Sarah ran. The department store's upper floor offered a grim view of the corridor's destruction. Fires raged unchecked through entire blocks. Military helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the smoke. In the streets below, infected moved with increasing coordination, establishing territories and hunting patterns. Sarah spotted the CDC perimeter, a heavily fortified position around Wayne State's medical campus. But reaching it meant crossing 6 blocks of infected-controlled territory. She checked her phone. No signal. The military was jamming communications to prevent panic from spreading to the wider city. A familiar voice called out behind her, "Dr. Chen." Diana emerged from the shadows, supporting Maria Santos. Luis clung to his mother's leg, terrified but quiet. "Mrs. Peterson?" Sarah asked. Diana shook her head. She went back for her husband. Wouldn't leave him. More explosions rocked the building. The military was concentrating their fire on the larger infected gatherings now, trying to disrupt their growing organization. But for every group they destroyed, 2 more emerged, learning from their predecessors' mistakes. "We need a distraction," Diana said, studying the street below. Something to draw them away from. The building trembled as a massive shape crashed through the floor behind them. Marcus Reeves stood in the rubble, but he'd changed. His body had mutated further, muscles bulging grotesquely beneath pale skin. Behind him, other infected poured through the hole, moving with coordinated precision. "Give me the drive," Marcus spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. "The research. Now." Sarah stumbled back. "You can talk? We evolve, adapt, become more." Marcus's lips pulled back in a horrific smile. "This is the next step. Humanity's replacement." Diana opened fire, emptying her magazine into Marcus's chest. The bullet struck home but seemed to cause only minor inconvenience. His wounds sealed almost instantly. The virus isn't just changing us, Marcus continued, advancing slowly. It's upgrading us, making us better, stronger, smarter. He gestured to his followers. We are the future. A massive explosion lit up the night sky. One of the military's bombs had struck a gas main, creating a chain reaction that set off multiple secondary explosions. The floor beneath them began to crack. The drive, Sarah whispered to Diana. Get it to the CDC. I'll hold them here. Sarah, no. Take them. Sarah shoved the drive into Diana's hands, then pushed Maria and Luis toward the fire escape. Go. As Diana led the others away, Sarah faced Marcus. You want to know what the research says? The virus is killing you. Every evolution, every mutation brings you closer to total cellular breakdown. You're not the future. You're a dead end. Marcus roared, a sound of pure rage that shattered windows. He charged forward just as the floor gave way. Sarah dove aside as Marcus and his followers plunged through the collapsing structure. She rolled to her feet and ran. The next hour was a blur of fire and violence. Sarah made her way through the burning corridor, drawing as many infected as she could away from Diana's group. She caught glimpses of them sometimes, moving from shadow to shadow, getting closer to the CDC perimeter. Finally, exhausted and smoke-stained, Sarah found herself cornered in the ruins of the free clinic. She'd come full circle. Through the broken windows, she could see Diana's group reaching the military checkpoint. They'd made it. Marcus found her there, his mutated form filling the doorway. More infected gathered behind him, their movements becoming increasingly erratic. Sarah smiled grimly. The cellular breakdown was beginning. It's over, Marcus. The research will help them develop a cure. Your evolution ends here. Marcus charged forward just as the clinic's support beams gave way. The building collapsed, burying them both in tons of burning debris. 3 months later, Diana stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional committee. Dr. Wong's research was instrumental in developing the vaccine, she explained. The virus was engineered to create a coordinated superorganism using urban rat populations as vectors. But the same mechanism that allowed the infected to evolve so quickly also caused their eventual breakdown. And the origin? A senator asked. Do we know who created it? Diana hesitated. Evidence suggests it was a rogue biotech firm, but their records were destroyed in the containment operation. What matters is that we're better prepared now. The vaccine has been distributed to major urban centers worldwide, and new protocols are in place for early detection. She didn't mention the rumors, stories of infected rats appearing in other cities, of strange behaviors and missing persons. The Cass Corridor outbreak had been contained, but Diana knew better than anyone. Evolution never truly stops. In Detroit, the corridor was being rebuilt. The official story blamed a gas main explosion and subsequent fire for the destruction. Few knew the full truth, and fewer spoke of it. But sometimes in the deepest parts of the night, residents swear they can hear sounds in the old tunnel systems. Scratching, scurrying, organizing, waiting, evolving. And in the shadows, red eyes watch and plan and remember.